Ryan, one of the motivations that I would have, honestly, to believe in God is that's probably the only way I'd even have a chance at life beyond this very limited one I've got. So let's talk about that. What that would mean in a theological or a philosophical context. What would eternal life mean? And I want to ask you in the context because I know how you view God's life, eternal life, being outside of time. So if God is outside of time and we then have an eternal life beyond this life, will we also be outside of time?
That's not possible. I don't think you could go from being in time as we are to outside of time, because you'd have to say that the outside time part came after the inside time part, but how could there be a relation of before or after between time and something outside time? Anything that's before or after something else is in time. Those are just temporal relations. But we could have a life that's eternal in a quantitative and a qualitative way. Quantitatively, it could just go on forever, temporally, in time.
That's easy to understand.
Yeah. Qualitatively, well, think about Boethius's definition of eternity as the whole fullness of a limitless life had all at once. Now, some of that has to do with being outside of time, but there's a notion of fullness, of perfection about it also. So a qualitatively eternal life could be a life that's like God's in the sense of involving a fullness, a perfection, a happiness that is denied us here.
So what you'd be saying is that we will have a limitless life, but it's kind of an odd kind of eternity that has an a limitless future, but a limited past.
Right.
And yet God is totally outside of that. So in that future, it doesn't seem like we'd be any closer to God. If we're still in time in our eternal lives, and God is outside of time, he seems just as distant as he is today.
We would not be any closer to God in terms of our metaphysical status or the kind of thing we are, but we could be closer to God in terms of our relationship to him, our knowledge of him, our likeness to him. In all those respects, there could be limitless progress.
But it would seem that if God is outside of time and we are forever burdened to be in time, that is an unbridgeable gap.
Metaphysically, certainly. It's never going to get any less. God's always going to be a different kind of thing than we are. But in terms of character, moral character, degree of happiness, degree of mutual understanding and relationship, that would be a gap that could certainly get smaller over time. I mean, it happens even within this life.
And in your vision of eternal life, as it goes on without limit, are there dangers of boredom?
There have been arguments that a limitless existence would eventually get boring. Would it be too pat to say, look, if there's a God around, he can certainly make sure that doesn't happen? I mean, it sounds kind of trite, but I mean, seriously, if you've got all the power of omnipotence to sort of make sure it keeps on being worth living, surely that's power enough to manage it. And also more seriously, I mean, the guy who made the boredom argument was just an atheist dyed in the wool from day one. So he didn't take seriously certain possibilities that perhaps a religious person would have taken seriously. It might very well be that God, if we sort of saw him face to face, whatever exactly that means, wouldn't be the kind of thing you can get bored with.
Just by essence and definition that God is there. Because certainly if we would have a boredom problem, then God himself would have that same problem. And if God doesn't have it, then maybe we wouldn't either.
Right.
Or some would say that the reason God created us was because God was bored.
Well, I think if God's bored, he's imperfect. So since I believe that God's a perfect being, and I think there are good reasons to think that, I don't think the boredom rationale is a good one. God, as a perfect being, might have created us out of a desire to be benevolent and generous. That wouldn't imply that he was bored. What would it be like to see God face to face? We really have no idea. But
is that even a coherent concept if God is outside of time? Can you even think about seeing something that's outside of time?
if God, who is outside of time, can see us in time, the gap can be bridged in at least one direction. So I don't see any reason that it couldn't be bridged in the other way. Again, I believe that God is atemporal, yet I also believe that people have had religious experiences of God. If that's so, then again, it seems that it's possible to see God even though God is outside of time.
And that in an afterlife, that would be enhanced, that possibility.
Right.
Does your religious conviction give you certainty that there is such an afterlife?
I believe it on the basis of my faith acceptance of the basic doctrines of Christianity. I wouldn't have any particular reason to think it was true otherwise.